Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 718, and today is November 27th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Before we get into the content today, I want to remind people that there's an all-new show that I'm doing, the Kyle Anzalone Show, and the second episode of that show is now out. It's like Conflicts of Interest, but a lot better. I got a production team helping me put the show together, making sure everything looks crisp. We have, cuts, we're playing clips. We have really cool articles and different quotes to display. The show looks amazing, and it really just enhances what I'm doing here at Conflicts of Interest. And let me tell you something, it's only the second episode, so it's definitely going to continue to get better, and it's already, like I said, just steps ahead of what we're doing here. So if you like Conflicts of Interest, you're going to love the Kyle Anzalone Show. Please take a second, open a new tab. If you're on YouTube, wherever you're watching, I have the Kyle Anzalone Show as the very top of the show notes. And so either copy and paste it into a new tab and hit the subscribe button, or if you can, just click the link and go ahead and give me a subscribe on the Kyle Anzalone Show. That's going to really help us get some momentum and get going. I know I have, thousands of subscribers on this channel. I have thousands of subscribers, our followers on Twitter. If you all head on over to the Kyle Anzalone Show and subscribe, it's going to help us kind of craft the YouTube algorithm and start to get that show out there in front of more and more people. And like I said, I think we're working on something really cool there. And the first two episodes have been great, and I'm excited because it's only going to get better. So if you all could do that for me, I would really appreciate it. And no more plugs. I'll just get right into the news today because boy, do we have some important news. The first story up here is a follow-up from one I wrote on Friday where we broke down that New York Times article that said the White House believes that they essentially have a free hand to act in Ukraine over the next 2 months because Donald Trump is a puppet of Vladimir Putin. And so Putin's not going to escalate the war too much before his puppet returns to power. And so their plan is to continue to escalate, and they have even talked about providing Ukraine with nuclear weapons. So Dave DeCamp has here on Tuesday, the Kremlin responded to a recent report from the Times that they said the US and European officials had discussed the idea of giving Ukraine nuclear weapons, with the Kremlin calling the talk absolutely irresponsible. The report cited anonymous sources, and several officials suggested the idea while they were discussing steps to deter Russia, but noted arming Ukraine with nuclear weapons would be complicated and have serious implications. So the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said the idea of sending nukes to Ukraine probably came from fringe extremist flank among Ukraine's Western backers. He said the talk was absolutely irresponsible deliberations by people who probably have poor understanding of reality and who do not feel a shred of responsibility for potential consequences. And look, I don't want to just agree with what the Kremlin is saying, but I kind of hope he's right that it is coming from the fringe extremist flank of the, Western discussions, and it's not coming from somebody, say, like Antony Blinken or Jake Sullivan. And look, if Russia looks at it this way, it probably means that Russia isn't going to have as big of a response. I do think since Russia acknowledged this, there is going to be some kind of response from the Russians. Not sure what that's going to be, but I think anytime there's talk of giving nuclear weapons to Ukraine, the Russians are going to respond. So the Times report said Biden could return nuclear weapons to Ukraine that were taken from it after the fall of the Soviet Union. But so it's not as if 30 years ago those nuclear weapons were handed over to the United States of America after the fall of the Soviet Union. Remember, Ukraine was a piece of the Russian Empire, not just the Soviet Union. So Ukraine had long been a part of Russia, and Moscow, as a part of the Soviet Union, stored some of its nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory, which at the time was effectively a state, right? This is like Washington, D.C. storing its nuclear weapons in, say, Texas or North Dakota, right? And so when the Soviet Union broke up, those weapons are now in a state that's not necessarily a nuclear power, right? Russia is the nuclear power. I believe Kazakhstan also maybe had a nuclear weapon left over in this way. And both Ukraine and Kazakhstan, or whatever that third country was, did end up transferring their nuclear weapons back to the Kremlin. And so those weapons went to Russia, not to the United States. And what they would be talking about here is giving Ukraine an American nuclear weapon, not that they had this one sitting on the shelf to return to the Ukrainians. Now, there's this story, and then there's that other story that was, I want to say, from the Times of London, was from a European outlet. And I covered that on the show maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. And this is something that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage. I'm really surprised at how little coverage this story has gotten, where the Ukrainian government, a think tank very close to the Ukrainian government, by an author very close to the Ukrainian government, presented his report to the Ukrainian government saying that Ukraine could throw together a rudimentary nuclear weapon. And so, we have a lot of talks about the Ukrainians getting nukes right now. So some lawmakers responded to the report, including Senator Mike Lee. And I actually have Lee's tweet up here because, as I'm sure some of you know, but if you don't, I, myself, Connor Freeman, Dave DeCamp, the crew over at antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute are frequently reprinted by Zero Hedge, which is a major site that, gets a lot of traction. Obviously, U.S. lawmakers and policymakers read Zero Hedge. And Mike Lee is actually retweeting my article here that I had wrote for antiwar.com last Friday and that we had discussed on the show. And what Lee says while retweeting, if true, this is treasonous. That would have caused World War III if Biden sent nukes to Ukraine. The presidency has too much power if it can unilaterally make non-emergency decisions that is tantamount to an act of war. And so let's hope that Lee is ready to take serious actions to prevent this from happening. My concern is that, it's just a tweet, but, it's good to see somebody on the American side take notice, and in a concerned way, not to say, oh, this is something we should be considering or should be doing. And then Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene also responded to this in an X post, and she was responding to a summary in my article that was kind of poached by one of the major, content people on X that do that kind of thing. So MTG posted, "This is all caps, insane and completely unconstitutional, probably an act of treason. This must be stopped immediately. Is the Biden administration trying to start a nuclear war and use it as the reason to stop the transfer of power to Trump?" Now, I definitely agree with the first, 90% of that statement. I'm not sure if this is about preventing the transfer of power to Trump or just making sure that Trump will be unable to end the war in Ukraine once he took office. This is all parts of reports that that they're trying to Trump-proof the aid to Ukraine, that they're trying to prevent Trump from being able to end the war in Ukraine. So they've given Ukraine, or they're planning to give Ukraine, an additional $7 billion in weapons from the United States. They're working on improving and putting together a $50 billion loan for Ukraine that Kiev will be able to use to buy weapons. And so these things are going to allow Kiev to resist Trump's pressure to demand that they go to the table and negotiate with Moscow, and they are able to continue the war for some time. All right, next up here, report, France, UK discuss idea of sending troops to Ukraine. The French newspaper Le Monde has reported that European countries have resumed talks on the idea of sending troops or private contractors to Ukraine. The report said the talks restarted on November 11th during a meeting between French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Earlier this year, Macron was pushing the idea of Western troops deployments to Ukraine, but it received little support at the time. While the leads have revealed there are a small number of NATO special operating soldiers in Ukraine, including British soldiers who are helping fire the Storm Shadow missiles, which are the long-range missiles that the UK has authorized Ukraine to fire deep into Russian territory. What Macron has been calling for was larger, a public deployment and potentially to train Ukrainian soldiers. Now, I wonder if the decision or this talk has received any more support since Biden signed off on the Pentagon paying contractors, so private American, former military members, to go to Ukraine and to repair Ukrainian weapons. So back in June, Marcon said he was finalizing a plan to send French soldiers to Ukraine to train Ukrainian troops, but he appeared to bat down on the plan following reported warnings from Russia that French troops may be considered legitimate targets. The Le Monde report said that the discussions on sending troops restarted in the wake of President-elect Donald Trump's election victory. As European leaders who support the proxy war fear he will wind down U.S. funding for Ukraine, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov dismissed the Le Monde report, saying it doesn't correspond with reality because there are little support in European capitals for sending troops to Ukraine. I certainly hope he's right, although I do think that the West here is ready to escalate in an incredibly irresponsible way. Again, it sounds like absolute lunacy, right? That they would think that there's no Russian red lines between now and January 20th. And for those of us who actually remember the first Trump administration, what did he do? He sanctioned Russia. He sent long-range weapons he sent Javelin lethal weapons for the first time to Ukraine. He increased the war games and made them further closer to Russia's border. He expelled Russian diplomats from the U.S. And so there's no reason to see Trump as anything but a Russia hawk. And had Biden not been, waging a proxy war against Russia over these past couple of years, we could consider Trump one of the more hawkish anti-Russian American presidents in history. It's only Biden that just completely sets a new standard out of the water. We're talking about giving Ukraine nuclear weapons. All right. So this one from Dave DeCamp report. And just one more quick plug for the Kyle Anzalone show here. We, over there, I do have, again, a team working with me. And so it's not just myself. So when I have the wrong article up, I don't have to pause the show and try to go fix it for you and then hop back into it. I got producers to make sure that the right articles are always the ones popping onto the screen for me. So the article I want to talk about here is top NATO official tells European businesses to get ready for war. So the head of NATO's military committee has called for European businesses to prepare a wartime scenario amid soaring tensions between Western military alliance and Russia. Dutch Admiral Rob Brouwer, who has made some provocative statements in the past, said Western business leaders must adjust to become less vulnerable to both Russia and China. He said, if we can make sure that all crucial services and goods can be delivered no matter what, then that is a key part of our deterrence. Brouwer said emergency supplies could be targeted or used as weapons of war. He said, we're seeing that with the growing number of sabotage acts and Europe has to deal with energy supply. We thought we had a deal with Gazprom, but we actually had a deal with Mr. Putin. And the same goes for the Chinese-owned infrastructure and goods. We actually have a deal with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Now, one thing that I want to say here is it seems like he's blaming Russia for blowing up their own gas pipelines, the Nord Stream 1 and 2, when we all know by now that that was certainly someone on the Western side of this war, if not directly the Americans, as Seymour Hersh has explained. And so, it's not the sabotage of infrastructure is certainly going on at least on both sides, if not primarily on the American and the Ukrainian side. And so, this is just needlessly inflammatory rhetoric from a top NATO official. All right, now here's some very concerning and very inflammatory rhetoric from a top Israeli official who has quite a bit of influence within the Israeli government. So I wrote this article for the Libertarian Institute on November 25th. Israeli minister, voluntary immigration of Palestinians is an opportunity during Trump presidency. So Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich declared his intention to exploit the Donald Trump presidency to conduct an ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. He believes he can cut the population of Gaza in half in 2 years' time. So this is what he said. It is possible to create a situation where Gaza's population in 2 years will be less than half its current size. Encouraging voluntary immigration is an opportunity that arises with the new administration. The finance minister, who is himself a settler in the West Bank and has promoted building Jewish settlements in Gaza, made the remarks while speaking at the Yashada Council, an umbrella organization for settlements authorities in the West Bank. So Smotrich continued, it is possible and necessary to take civilian responsibility for Gaza. The IDF needs to be there to maintain security, prevent Gaza from rearming and becoming a threat to Israeli citizens, and in the process, oversee civilian affairs. So following the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, Tel Aviv unleashed a devastating military campaign in Gaza that American doctors estimate killed well over 100,000 people in its first year. Much of the infrastructure in Gaza is being leveled with bombs, with Haaretz reporting earlier this week that the Jabalia refugee camp has been nearly eliminated. Israeli civilians have begun entering Gaza to scout locations for potential future settlements. And, I think that what Smoltrich is saying here is a real possibility and is probably the thing we need to work hardest and be the most vocal about, other than demanding an end to the war in Ukraine during the Trump presidency, that we cannot allow the Trump administration to sign off on this and allow this to happen. Although I do think he's right that, it in a sense presents an opportunity for him and the other extremists in the Israeli government to go ahead and do this. Now, of course, I got to talk about this phrase, voluntary immigration, that continues to come from Palestinian leadership as though the Palestinian people will ever voluntarily leave Gaza, the West Bank, or historic Palestine. What he's talking about here are plans that have been floated by the Israeli government. I think what they would prefer to do is drive the Palestinians out of Gaza somewhere deep into the Sinai Peninsula. But, seeing how that, I think that's unlikely for a number of reasons. The Egyptian government doesn't want a bunch of Palestinian refugees. It's already a country with a poor population. So, of course, adding 2 million new extremely poor displaced people is going to be an economic burden for the Egyptians. The Palestinians may be unhappy that they are, forced to live under the dictatorship of General al-Sisi. And if, they become political agitators and demand for more freedoms and things like that, well, that's another way that the Palestinians could become a problem for the Egyptians. And also, the Egyptian people are Muslims, and so they don't want to see their kind of fellow Palestinians removed from their ancestral homeland. And so I think the Egyptian people would prefer their government not aid and abet in that ethnic cleansing by allowing the Egyptians to allow the Palestinians to be driven into the Sinai. So what's the plan then? Well, really the only thing we've learned from the Israelis is there's kind of two. One is that they've talked to African countries, Rwanda, Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo, countries, that would be desperate for any kind of financing. And the Israelis, or probably more likely the Americans, would end up paying for those countries to take the Palestinians. I also think we should remember that there's the General's Plan, which is something that Israel seems to be enacting in northern Gaza, which is essentially to kill a large swath of the population and drive anyone else into densely populated tent camp cities where the population could be further cut. And so while it could be that they are trying to remove the Palestinians from Gaza, it's also possible that they're just trying to eliminate the Palestinians in Gaza altogether. Either way, it seems like the ethnic cleansing policies in effect, whether the Palestinians will be leaving or whether they will be dead at the hands of the Israelis. All right, next up here, this one from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. New Israeli-Lebanon ceasefire in effect, but IDF warns evacuation is still in effect. So at 9 p.m. last night, that was Tuesday night, 4 a.m. Beirut time, the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire officially took effect, potentially ending Israel's ongoing invasion and repeated airstrikes, which had killed thousands and displaced well over 1 million Lebanese civilians. The deal was broken brokered by the U.S., and the Israeli Security Cabinet voted earlier today to support it. The deal prescribes a 60-day ceasefire in which Hezbollah will move its armed assets north of the Litani River, and the Lebanese government is supposed to deploy its army to the southern area of the country as a buffer between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel, for their part, is intended to withdraw their ground soldiers from southern Lebanon and to stop attacking Lebanese territory. If Israel sees what they describe as suspicious movements, U.S. officials say they are to report it to the U.S.-led committee, which would forward the complaint to the Lebanese military. It is only after that point that they would be free to respond if Lebanon doesn't take action. The immediate question must be how the ceasefire will be implemented and when Israeli troops will actually leave. The Israeli military issued a statement after the ceasefire went into effect, warning Lebanese civilians against attempting to return to their homes in the evacuation zones, saying the prohibition is still in effect. He said Israel would inform them at a later date when it is safe to return. And this ceasefire was built as a way to return the Israelis and the Lebanese to their homes, and so it seems almost immediately like the Israelis are violating this ceasefire. So the immediate question, that does not inspire a lot of confidence, and seeming escalation of Israeli attacks in the last few hours before it came into effect added concerns. In those final hours, Israel carried out multiple attacks on North Lebanon border crossings into Syria and imposed new evacuation orders in multiple southern suburbs of Beirut. The attacks on the border crossings are noteworthy because during the war, Israel has repeatedly attacked main crossings through eastern Lebanon's Bekaa Valley into Syria. That made sense, as the Bekaa Valley is known as a Hezbollah haven. The northern crossings, on the other hand, lead into Syria's coastal area, and the Syrian state media reported a number of people were wounded in those attacks. The attacks on southern Beirut seem to be the last thing Israel did before the ceasefire went into effect, and the videos coming out of Beirut yesterday were absolutely horrific. You know, a city with just fire raising all from all around, all different areas. I'm sure Israel killed a lot of people. So I don't have a lot on that ceasefire yet. It's important to remember that last year on Thanksgiving week, so the same week, Israel did have a ceasefire in Gaza, and there was extension, a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah as well. So we'll see if this holds past the weekend or if this is just a short-term thing. Certainly we will have more on this, and we'll continue to update it here on the show. All right, before we wrap up today, there's a few stories on China that I wanted to touch on. First here, report U.S. to deploy missiles to southern Japanese islands if China attacks Taiwan. So the U.S. military will set up temporary bases to deploy missiles along Japan's southern islands in the event of a Taiwan contingency, Japanese Kyodo News reported on Sunday. The report said that under the first part of a joint U.S.-Japan operation plan, a new Marine Corps unit designed for island hopping in the Western Pacific, known as the Marine Little Regiment, will be deployed with HIMARS rocket systems along the Ryukyu Islands. The Ryukyu Islands, known as the Nasali Islands in Japan, include Okinawa and stretch south towards Taiwan. Japan's military will support the U.S. Marine deployment along the island chain by providing logistics support, including the supply of fuel and ammunition. The Kyoto report also said that the U.S. would deploy multi-domain task force long-range missiles units in the Philippines. Earlier this year, the U.S. deployed a new intermediate-range land-based missile system to the Philippines known as the Typhoon, which is capable of firing nuclear-capable Tomahawk missiles. The report said that the 4 new U.S. bases established in the Philippines as a part of a military deal signed last year are expected to be used to respond to a Chinese attack on Taiwan. All right, now let's move on and talk about this story that Dave DeCamp has. U.S. Navy plane flies over Taiwan Strait. So the U.S. Navy 7th Fleet said Tuesday that it flew a P-8A Poseidon surveillance plane over the sensitive Taiwan Strait in the latest U.S. provocation in that region. The Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA, criticized the transit and said that it deployed ships and planes in response to and to track the flight. So the spokesman for the PLA's Eastern Theater Command said the Theater Command mobilized naval and air forces to monitor and remain vigilant throughout the U.S. aircraft's transit, effectively responding and handling the situation. The U.S. frames its military activity in the Taiwan Strait as routine, even though it's highly provocative to China. The United States military flies, sails, and operates anywhere international law allows, the 7th Fleet said in a press release on the flight. So the Chinese spokesman said that China is urging the U.S. to stop distorting and hyping and to jointly safeguard regional peace and stability. Now, one thing that I want to point out is that I saw a lot of headlines on this yesterday, and most of them said China deployed naval and air forces to track and follow U.S. Navy reconnaissance plane as it transited Tuesday over the Taiwan Strait. And basically what they make out to be the big story is that there was a Chinese plane flying close to the American plane, not that that American plane was flying close to China in territory claimed by Beijing. All right, so let's wrap up here today by talking about this story. Chinese defense minister rejects talks with U.S. over Taiwan support. So on Tuesday, the Chinese defense ministry blamed the U.S. for the lack of talks between the two countries' defense ministries while they were both in Laos for meetings with South Asian officials. The U.S. said it asked for Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to hold talks with his Chinese counterpart on the sidelines of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Asian Defense Ministers meeting, but China declined due to U.S. support for Taiwan. Now, I think this is important because I think it shows a real shift in the way that Beijing wants to deal with the U.S., where I think traditionally China would be willing to talk to the U.S. and essentially always willing to talk to the U.S. because you don't know when it's going to help de-escalate tensions. I think Beijing has come to realize that the Americans will sit down and talk to you and may not say exactly what you want to hear, but they may say it in a way that sounds comforting, or they may signal that they are willing to de-escalate tensions if you de-escalate tensions. And in reality, these talks are just a way for the Americans to buy a little bit more time so they can escalate the war a little bit further. That there's never any de-escalation that's coming from Washington, and so talking with Washington about de-escalation is really meaningless and ineffective. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And one last time, if you haven't already, you've listened to this whole show, now go ahead and go subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. Please do that for me. I work really hard to bring you all a lot of really high quality content, and it would really help me out if you could do that. So thank you all so much. And for the rest of this week, I will have a show for Thanksgiving tomorrow, and I am planning to do a show as well on Friday, although the Friday show may depend a little bit on how much news I have available. And then next week, more episodes of Conflicts of Interest and the Kyle Anzalone Show. Thanks, everyone.